Hello everyone, and welcome to my Shadow Empire logistics tutorial. In this one I'm going to just cover the absolute basics, so what you need to maintain your empire and stop your units from starving to death. So at the most basic, logistics in Shadow Empire are all about having enough of these bad boys, and these bad boys are logistical points. I'm just going to press the hotkey L, which can also be found through the map layers bar on the right, so L goes current points. And as you can see, these green lines and the numbers. The numbers are how many logistical points are available in that hex, and the green line just shows the path they take. As you can see, they follow the roads. Right, so let's have a look at truck stations first. Truck station in the capital here produces 784. It should be producing 800, but there's something interfered during the turn. Probably my governor threw a tizzy and slightly reduced the output. But anyway, it's producing these 784 truck points and 98 action points. So how this works is truck points or action points are dispatched from your capital and spread out along roads, and only roads. They can't cross over barren deserts no matter what the terrain is. So your road network is the only thing they move along, and nothing else. There's organic supply units when units are off roads, but that is a separate thing we will address in a minute. So for right now, just looking at logistical points and your logistical network, roads are the only things they follow. So that seems fair enough. Things request supplies, and that gets sent out in the first wave, and then after that the remaining ones in this pool of 784, which I'll just switch off units and zoom in, we can see we've still got 692 left because some were used building and moving stuff. So these 800 points spread out in all directions. These little numbers here, this is the P preview points mode again in the map layers, and L and P are going to be your best friends for figuring out how Shadow Empire works, because they are incredibly useful for tracking down anything that's gone wrong in your logistical network, and also for planning for the future. So right, at the basic level we've got roads, and there are dirt roads and sealed roads. I'm just going to spend a little bit of action points to build one there so you can see what they look like. They're just a little sealed road. Unsurprisingly, everyone has them these days. So logistic points spread out along these roads, and the key thing here to remember is this action point number. So each sealed road takes 7 action points to move along, and each dirt road takes 12 points. This is irrespective of whatever terrain they're crossing over. To build roads through deserts or things like mountains is much more expensive, and so it's accounted for when you build the road rather than making logistics harder to shuffle through them at later dates. Right, so just look at this fruit as an example. We have, going off the right here, we have 300, 153 because it splits in half, and then there's this 153 continues smoothly along here. And because we've got 100 action points, well, 98, but I'm going to call it 100, it deducts 12 action points per hex. So it's going to be costing 12, 24, 36, 48, 60, 72, 84, 96, and 108. And once it reaches that 108, or rather the 98 points at this hex, so it's about 9 hexes, I think. I didn't count them exactly. What you'll notice is we start to see a reduction. And that reduction is based on the amount, a percentage equal to how many action points more than the amount that were generated. So this one, it's going to lose about 12% every turn, not turn, sorry, so every hex, until eventually the supply peters out and goes to nothing, because it's just it has traveled along this whole road, losing action points the whole while, and eventually just the trucks can't do it anymore. They're too far from their base and they have to turn around. And less and less and less gets delivered every hex until you hit nothing. It's fairly straightforward. You just have to remember these two numbers, the total points, and which is how much can be distributed, and the action points, which is how far it can be distributed. One little wrinkle in the system, which I quite like, is the introduction of supply bases. So there's a supply base here, and these two roads, I've just built them in the previous turn just to snake off and show you as an example, are roughly similar lengths. And this one here, you can see the split here, the 202 points becomes 138 and 64, but just as an example, I will block off all points going that way using the traffic sign, just so we can get another example here. And as you can see, they come along here, they're losing action points every time until they hit the supply depot, which is in this hex. And supply depots don't actually produce any logistical points. What they do is provide extension to those logistical points. So these 137 points entering the hex with about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, they will have about 30 logistical action points left because they've been generated with 100. It's degraded as they travel along the roads, and so they'll have about 30 here. And because it provides 50, or this particular turn 49, that 30 turns into 80. So suddenly they have a new lease on life and they just continue along. Whereas about here, normally they would start seeing this degradation in the amount of points that can be carried along the road. They just keep going for another basically 5 hexes because of that 50 point boost. Eventually they do start to degrade, but as you can see, using supply depots, you can provide significantly longer range truck supplies. Now, supply bases only work for trucks. There's no effect on rail stations. And if you're in the preview points, which is here, you can actually click on it and it will tell you, this little bolded number, how many more points there are available in the hex compared to if it wasn't there. So you can see at this point, it would start degrading. There'd be 27 less points, there'd be 40 less points, 55 less points. But because of it, you can see the actual number, the 137 there, maintains a lot further out. So yeah, that's the basics of truck stations and supply depots. Now I'm going to switch units back on and do a quick explanation of how they work and how they pull supplies. So all these units have runoff. Some of them are closer to roads than others, but the ones on roads, simple, they just pick supplies up from the road. That's no issue at all. But the tricky bit comes to the ones that are off roads. Now you can go to look at what's happening, you can go to map layers and then go to used points, which these white ones are the logistical network. That's just how many points have been used, but largely by units requesting supplies. And then the dotted ones with the color coding are the off-road. So units have an organic supply range, which is they call back to the closest bit of road on your logistical network at the start of every turn and go, hey, we need resupply. And in this case, we'll just use this militia unit as an example. It's called back to this hex because that's the closest piece of road, or rather it's equidistant with this one, and it's chosen this one for whatever reason it has done so. And it's gone, we've eaten food, we've used ammo, so it requests both of those. And from this, you get what's called organic supply range. And you can check the organic supply depends on the type of terrain in the hex. But for example, you can look down the bottom right here and it says organic supply, 12 action points. And these units have a 50 action point base for requesting supply. So 12, 24, 36. And because it's only 36 out of 50, it receives full supply. If you go number 6, it's the overlay. It's not the greatest example here because I've got all these roads squiggling everywhere. But you can see the yellow and green. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's 48 action points for organic supply. So beyond that 48, which is the 50 cap, starts to get reduced. And it's the same. It's like you can grab supply about double the 50 action points, which is, you can say as a rule of thumb, 4 hexes unless there's dreadful terrain, and then you start to receive less supplies. We'll do an example here. Say, for example, I cut this road. And then I'll press P to refresh the preview points, then 6 again to refresh that. Because the road's cut and only reaches here, you can see sort of 1, 2, 3, 4 hexes from the end of the road, and then it starts to degrade. And this yellow roughly represents 75% of the supplies that you want reach the unit. The blue, 50%. The red, 25%. And if it's like blank, means there's no supplies reaching the unit because there's no road that is close enough to drop supplies and have them picked up by the unit's organic supply capacity, which you can sort of imagine as there are trucks along with the unit, or there are horses, or some sort of dinosaur camel hybrid. You know, it's the future. And you're on a different planet, and it can literally be anything you want. Right, so essentially you just have to keep your units close enough to a road which actually has supply, and they will stay in supply. And this number 6 hotkey is the key thing. Done it there. Is the key thing for telling if units are going to be out of supply. So if I was going to take this man and move him over to here, you can see he's outside that, and he won't be able to pick up any supplies next turn. So the amount he has here, he's got fuel, food. You click on the unit, and then this little supply thing tells you what the unit actually has. Or you can just simply look at the little box in the corner. If it's green, it's good, and that's just color coded by how much of the supplies it received last turn. So this guy here, next turn, he's not going to be able to pick up anything because he's out of supply range. You can just kind of see it's a bit unfortunate for him, but such is life. The one thing it is important to note is that this color coding doesn't apply to food. As long as there's enough logistical points on the road itself, and they're in range of anything at all, the unit will always receive its full food allotment. What it won't receive the full amount of is ammunition, energy, fuel, that sort of stuff. So it's not going to starve to death as long as it's able to receive any supply at all from a road network, but it will become combat ineffective. Now, the final thing before we move on to having a look at rails is making your road networks efficient. Now, because of the way Shadow Empire does this, these are all requesting logistics every turn. This P key is what's going to happen next turn. So you see it's spending about 600 between these two branches to supply them all. And it's the same for here. This was what was available at the start of the turn. This is with the L key, so it hasn't actually taken into account we've cut the road there yet. But as you can see, the P key, which shows what will happen next turn, has done so. So logistically, we've got probably about 2/3 of our resources being used and sent this way because they have to fuel these assets. So ice mines, metal mines, etc. And assets request 100 logistical points per level of asset. So these are all level 1 assets, so they're all requesting 100. And the little extra numbers are because the units are requesting it. And you can sort of see it traces back to here and here. Now, that's fine. I mean, it's not urgent because it's the start of the game. We've got excess capacity. The real problem is pushing it further using things like this supply depot. But let's have a look at how we can make this network more efficient. If we were to say demolish the road there and then rebuild a new road. So it's a continual road that passes through the assets one at a time. This is what we're doing. We're using about 600 to cover these ones. But if we go P, which is projected assets for next turn, now we are merely using 200 to cover them all. You can see the higher numbers because after all the requests like this from the units and assets and other cities are taken into account, it just kind of, if there's leftover, it just kind of sends them out evenly in every direction across the network. And you can adjust that with traffic signs, but that's slightly more advanced, and I'll be covering that later. So we're just going to close off this road to everything except requested points, and then, as you can see, there's a little blocker there. And then with this 200, so there's much more available to go in the other direction, whereas last turn there was 140 spare points, now there's 580. It's just an example of sort of good practice to use the minimal amount of logistical points to cover the maximum amount of assets. It does use the action points traveling through all these hexes, so you kind of want to have offshoots that do this and just have the minimal amount, whereas your main trunk roads should all be generally separate from these unless you can avoid it, to avoid like this squiggling about it does, which reduces how far you can project it because of the action points. Right, the very final thing is, if you're a bit confused about your logistics, you don't know what is happening and what is going where, you can go to T, press the T hotkey, which is the traffic light one, and then click on your hex. And it tells you what's happened. So 800 points, logistical points worth truck movement were generated, and then it does the round of pulling. So southeast 239 points, south 200 points, 126 to the northwest, and it sends those. And then, as you can see here, it has a leftover, so it just kind of sends the equal amount down every road. I hope that makes sense and helps you. We're going to move on to a slightly different map now and have a look at rail, so I will see you in a second. So we are going to pick this up on a slightly different map, and on this one you'll note there is rail. So rails work in a similar way to truck stations in terms of they generate logistical points, which are rail points, and they also generate rail action points. This is a second level one, so it's actually generating slightly more than the 100 you'd expect. You can actually see by clicking on the asset here what it will produce. So a level 1 will produce 2,000 points and 100 AP, but because we're level 2 we produce 4,000 points and 110 AP. So in a similar way to roads, rail points respond to the same things like pull points, and they just travel out along rails. But the key thing about them is, unlike roads, which just shuffle the action points down them at full capacity the whole way, rail stations need an endpoint. So have a look down here, we've got a railhead, and railhead's a very cheap building. It basically, all it does is provide a tiny source of rail points so your rail can drop off there. Without it, and I will just build a little bit further out into the middle of nowhere, and you can see there's nothing to this turn using the L key, but per P we have basically 2,000. I'm just going to quickly shut off all truck logistics going that way, so we are only able to see the rail. So it's confounded by the truck transport hub here having that, so I'm just going to do the same thing in this direction. This just kind of shows you how much you can customize your network should you so desire. So this is now restricted by these traffic lights, and 1,923 rail points are going in this direction. And these rail points head along until they reach the railhead, which lets them unload up to their 2,000 points. So we basically have a connection between them, which doesn't have any capacity to drop off stuff in the in-between hexes, but at the zone, a headquarters, or wherever you put a rail station or a railhead, it has a lot of points. And the other key thing about the rail points is that whereas trucks lose 12 action points for a dirt road and 7 action points for a sealed road for every hex, rail only lose 2 points for every hex. So a rail network is capable of traveling much, much, much further before it starts to degrade. It's basically very expensive, but it generally forms the logistical backbone of your empire. So it does the shuffling around of resources between zones rather than the sending supplies from zones to your units. That's usually done by trucks, because unless the rail is very close, sorry, the rail head or rail station at the end is very close to the units, it won't be close enough for the units to pull from it with organic supplies. So you need the trucks to kind of bridge the gap between them. Now, the other thing is, you can see over here, I've built this railway off to nowhere, but it's still drawing 200 points. And that is because they have a thing where you can send rail points along a railway without a railhead or a rail station, but you receive a 90% malus to the amount of points. Basically, this represents trains not having anywhere or any infrastructure to offload on, so they're just trying to offload onto the dirt, and it's very difficult, and you basically spend a lot of time and energy just achieving not a lot. But what the key thing it does do is you can build along, and that's enough points to generate a new asset in the hex. So you could just go construct logistics railhead, and that would probably be built next turn, and then you'd have full flow of the rail points to that. As long, I mean, it would be built as long as you have the required energy, industrial, etc. Now, other than that, rail is fairly similar. It does all the same jobs as truck points, just in a more restrictive fashion and over greater distances. The other difference is there is no such thing as a depot. So you can't actually extend it. The maximum distance you can efficiently do a rail is, because of the 2 action points, is about 50 hexes, which is a very long way. And I've never really had any situations where rail couldn't reach far enough to connect my cities. It could happen on a larger map, but it is fairly rare. So yeah, that covers the absolute basics of logistics, and I'm going to do another video doing the advanced stuff and the sort of shuffling stuff between zones and all the industrial side of it, as well as how to use traffic lights. But this covers the basics, and I hope you all enjoy this, or at least got something from it. So thanks a lot, everyone, and I will see you soon.